Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. My name is Dave Odoricio. I'm a professor at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, California. I teach in our Mythological Studies MA and PhD program. And I'm just really thrilled to be joining you to share a little bit about this topic for your Contemporary Expressions of Spirituality course. So just give me a moment here and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So the topic that I'm going to be sharing with you today is two phrases that I'm borrowing from the comparative scholar of religion, Jeff Kripal, from his book Comparing Religions. And these terms or phrases are psychedelic comparativism and the chemical technologies of mysticism. Right? So those are the really the two topics, as well as the title for my talk today. So the first thing we need to do is examine the terms in question. And the first is around psychedelics, what that term means, a little bit of the history behind it, and then the more contemporary term that's used that you might be familiar with is entheogen. So first, psychedelic translates from the Greek, two Greek words, psyche and delos. So soul, or in the way it's translated by Aldous Huxley as mind. So mind manifesting. Right? And this is a term that came out of Aldous Huxley's correspondence with the British psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond in 1956. Huxley originally proposed the term phanerethine, which comes from another set of Greek words meaning to manifest, as well as the spirit, thumos. And they composed this sort of rhyme or couplet back and forth. And Huxley sent to Osmond this little poem: to make this mundane world sublime, take 0.5 gram of phanerethine. To which Osmond responds, to fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And that's how the word is born. And of course, it caught on among 1950s counterculture, the beat poets, and then of course exploded in the 1960s and hung around until today. Now, this correspondence came out of Aldous Huxley's experience that he wrote about in The Doors of Perception in 1954, when he had his first experience with mescaline. And it was based out of that book came an entire sort of cultural movement, as well as critique. But that Huxley and The Doors of Perception is really where we can trace the origins of this conversation around psychedelics and mysticism, or psychedelic mysticism, that we're really going to look at throughout the presentation today. So this next word, entheogen, which can literally translate as engendering the divine within. Again, two Greek words, antheos and genesthai. Entheos, to be full of the god, and genesthai, to come into being. These are very Dionysian terms that we could trace back to the early mystery cults of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And this term came into being with the late 20th century ethnobotanists. So folks like Ruck and Gordon Wasson, Schultz, they were writing in the late 70s and 80s, as we'll look at in a minute, trying to recover the conversation from the war on drugs. So as you probably know, LSD was outlawed in the 70s, and for better and for worse, to curtail the sort of abuses of LSD in the counterculture. But what that also did was it also stopped all the remarkable research that was happening with LSD in psychotherapy, LSD in the treatment of addiction, LSD in the treatment of alcoholism. So with the war on drugs came the real sort of shutdown and outlawing of these substances. And then these ethnobotanists were trying to really bring more of the healing, medicinal, and religious aspects of plant medicines back into the culture. So they didn't want to use the word psychedelic. So instead they came up with this other term, entheogen, which is also something that you hear used in the counterculture today. Now, what do I mean by psychedelic comparativism? What we're really talking about is the way in which these late 20th century scholars, mostly white male intellectuals of European or North American heritage or ancestry, in a certain sense, appropriated, co-opted, in complicated ways that did not always benefit, or in some circumstances overtly damaged the cultures in question. And what ended up happening was this entire slew of research that came out following the criminalization of LSD, and in the 70s and beyond, more oriented around psilocybin. In other words, commonly known as the magic mushroom. All right, so this began John Allegro's study from 1970, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, where he denies the historicity of a historical Jesus, and instead claims that early Christianity was actually a mushroom cult, and that Jesus was actually sort of a stand-in, or Jesus was the mushroom, so to speak. So that early Christianity actually grew up out of a mushroom cult. And then this origins, it's sort of like an origin story, right? Because all of the interest is around the origins of religion. So 1971, Gordon Wasson, who was the first Westerner to really partake of psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico, in Mazatec communities in Oaxaca. He was the first Westerner. Maria Sabina, who was the famous practitioner in Mazatec. And what Wasson does, sort of true to colonial form, he ends up having this experience, saying that he won't share anything that happens. Then he ends up writing a story that appears, explodes in America. He writes like a journalistic piece that just explodes, and all of a sudden, just hordes of people are flocking to Oaxaca, and there's very, very negative impacts on the local culture there. So this is one of the very, it's not the earliest, but it's sort of a form of neo-colonialism of how, and really highlights the difficulties of the interaction between Western scholars and intellectuals and the indigenous cultures in which these medicines originate. So his 1971 book is looking at Soma. Soma, for those of you that know the Hindu tradition, Soma in the Rig Veda, which are the very, very ancient Hindu texts, South Asian Indian texts, that are a series of hymns to different divinities. There's a dozen or so hymns to Soma, and Soma is this drink. It's this sort of highly spiritualized beverage that scholars never really knew what it was, and were sort of always guessing. And Gordon Wasson made the case that Soma was actually a mushroom. So again, we have this origin story. And then again, in 1978, a group of scholars, again, Gordon Wasson, Albert Hoffman, who was the first to synthesize LSD. You can see a painting of him here to the right of the screen, and Carl Ruck, they were all speculating as to the origins of the ancient Greek mysteries. So how did the mystery cults work? The mysteries of Eleusis, for example. And again, they're tracing the origins of mysticism, the origins of religion, back to some sort of a psychedelic, psychotropic experience. Into the 90s, 1993, Terence McKenna, his very popular Food of the Gods, and if you notice the subtitle, The Search for the Original Tree of Knowledge. So again, there's the play on the biblical story of Genesis, and again, connecting the origins of religion to some sort of plant or psychotropic type of substance. And moving into the late 90s, Dan Merker's Mystery of Mana and the Psychedelic Sacrament, where he traces or attempts to trace, again, psychedelic or psychotropic substances as the origins of, in the Mystery of Mana, he's claiming that mana in the desert was actually some sort of a psychedelic sacrament that the Israelites partook of. And then in his 2001 Psychedelic Sacrament, he's talking about the Eucharist and making connections between medieval practices of the Eucharist and potential altered states of consciousness. This is something that again resurfaces in Brian Muraresco's very recent New York Times bestseller, The Immortality Key. And again, notice the subtitle, The Secret History of the Religion with No Name. Now, what is that religion? That religion is the history of psychedelics and psychedelic substances. So what Muraresco does is he really summarizes a lot of the research that came before him and then tries to bring it forward, connecting to the present day, using recent archaeological discoveries to trace the uses of certain types of substances across early religious traditions, both in the ancient history as well as in late antiquity. Another piece that I want to look at regarding psychedelic comparativism is this question of lens and frame. So what ends up happening in the 50s and 60s, as more of the counterculture begins to experiment with different psychedelic substances, they realize that they don't really have a map or a frame of reference of how to understand or integrate these experiences. So in 1964, Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, who eventually becomes Ram Dass, the spiritual teacher, and Ralph Metzner, they were originally all colleagues at Harvard, they end up using the Tibetan Book of the Dead, specifically Evan Wentz's 1927 translation, as a roadmap for what they call the psychedelic experience. Right? So here we have sort of one of the earliest versions of psychedelic appropriation, right? Using another culture's frame of reference, lens, text, religious symbols, and what we could, I guess, call archetypes, different deities, both wrathful as well as benign, that can guide the psychonaut on their experiences into the unconscious, right? Or into the underworld of the psyche. So this is sort of one of our earliest instances of psychedelic appropriation and what we could call a sort of psychedelic comparativism, right? Using comparative studies, the comparative study of religion as a way to frame the psychedelic experience. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, this brings up further issues of cultural appropriation and forms of neocolonialism. This happens both with the present day medical model, where the sort of medical industrial complex is attempting to co-opt and utilize plant medicines, both commercially in a very capitalist way, as well as therapeutically and medically in other ways that are meant to be more healing. So you have a number of different instances of this, both in modern research institutes like NYU, UCLA, Johns Hopkins, as well as in the sort of more shadowy or shady industry of ayahuasca tourism, where a lot of Westerners are traveling to the Amazon basin to have these sorts of spiritual experiences, psychotherapeutic experiences, but are oftentimes not aware of or familiar with or even respectful of the kinds of cultures in which they are entering or taking from. And that's partly one of the reasons that gave rise to the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines, which is a nonprofit that exists today and centers around educating folks and being an ally for indigenous traditions in their primary cultures and contexts. Another piece around psychedelic comparativism is looking at festival culture, which is a very sort of a certainly American phenomenon in the sense of the scope and the size of something like Burning Man, which is extraordinarily unique and even more particular to something like California, what scholar Eric Davis refers to as California consciousness. Highly connected to spiritual but not religious movements, can definitely be seen as a contemporary new religious movement, not just Burning Man itself, but the rise of festival culture as a whole, which of course has also given rise to the need for something like psychedelic peer support because of the amount of people that are having quote unquote bad trips or negative experiences. And MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, formed the Zendo project specifically for purposes of harm reduction at festival culture. And so another way to look at the sort of psychedelic comparativism, or to look at psychedelics through the lens of the comparative study of religion or the comparative study of new spiritual movements, is to look at festival culture as a sort of modern ritual and rite of passage for unchurched mystics and spiritual seekers of all kinds. Another example of psychedelic comparativism is the question of syncretism. So, for example, in the Native American Church, the Church of Daime, and UDV, the União do Vegetal. So these are the latter two Brazilian, South American churches that are oriented around the sacramental ingestion of ayahuasca, the Native American Church around peyote. But what you see in each is a sort of syncretism. So there's a hybridization of indigenous or local beliefs as well as dominant Christianity. So if you look at this image of the Daime altar used in the Santo Daime Church, you can see that it's a combination of indigenous or quote unquote shamanic types of items or objects, nature-based objects, as well as a Christian symbolism. So the cross is at the center there. And then with the Native American Church, you can see faith, hope, love, and charity, sort of the basic theological virtues that become integrated as part of their overall framework for understanding their relationship perhaps to the divine, which would be integrated and synthesized with their own much more ancient indigenous understandings of themselves or of the natural world. And the last piece here, psychedelic chaplaincy. All right, so talking about psychedelics in the future of religion, people are now starting to talk about and even provide training for psychedelic chaplaincy. So Harvard Divinity School is now in their second year of doing a year-long study and presentations on psychedelics and the history and future of religion. MAPS has been sponsoring presentations about this topic. And then in Oakland, California, the Sacred Garden Community, which is a contemporary church that is oriented around entheogenic substances and sacraments. All right, so there are even churches now that are coming into existence that orient around the uses of these substance sacred medicines that are not affiliated with other types of traditions. For example, you would see like the Native American Church or Santo Daime churches that we just looked at. They're completely sort of what we guess we could consider non-denominational entheogenic communities that are rising up for people to it's almost like sort of like the Unitarians of the psychedelic landscape, so to speak. So the second part of my presentation here, I want to use another phrase of Jeff Kripal's. He refers to as the chemical technologies of mysticism. Now, what this really has to do is the ancient history and even prehistory of what Mircea Eliade, the religious studies scholar, referred to as archaic techniques of ecstasy. So this is the use globally in almost all traditions of organic compounds to alter one's consciousness, whether it's cannabis, opium, alcohol, tobacco, peyote, etc. All the different ways in which cultures have attempted to alter consciousness in order to gain access to the divine. And then, of course, there's a particular resurgence of this in 19th and 20th century European and North American cultural elites. For example, scientists, physicians, anthropologists, certain literary figures, intellectuals, and of course, William James is one of the more cited or famous because of his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he also includes his own instance of experimentation with nitrous oxide. And this book, High Culture, by Christopher Partridge, is actually an extraordinarily well-written historical study of, as the subtitle reads, drugs, mysticism, and the pursuit of transcendence in the modern world. So part of this idea of chemical technologies of mysticism, and again, this is from Jeff Kripal in his book, Comparing Religions, he says these psychoactive supermolecules are built in such a way that they can plug into chemical receptors in the human brain, which appear to be ready-made just for this. We are made this way. This is how we co-evolve with the plant world. In other words, what he's saying is that these substances, these plants, these materials, the only reason they're psychedelic is because we are. Our brains, our receptors, the neurotransmitters, our very basic biological chemistry is actually hardwired towards altering our states of consciousness through these types of organic compounds, for example, dimethyltryptamine or DMT, which very organically matches, almost identically fits into the DMT receptors that already exist in the chemistry of our brains and in our bodies. Right? This is something that Rick Strassman highlights in his 2000 book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. Now, of course, as many know, this entire inquiry and area of study is not without its critics, both then as in 1950s, 60s, and 70s, as well as today. This is a quote from Robert Fuller's book on his history of drugs in America. He says, quote, the subject of drugs and religion is one of the most fascinating in all of religious history. It is also one of the most controversial. What, after all, is an authentic religious experience? Is it possible that religious experiences are nothing more than aberrations in our brain chemistry? Or is it possible that the kingdom of God is truly within us, but awaiting release through whatever means we can discover? So this question of authenticity in religious experience came up really strong in the 1950s, following Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception that I mentioned earlier. Only this time the critic is R.C. Zaehner, who was a Roman Catholic convert and comparative scholar of religion and mysticism at Oxford. And in his very influential book, Mysticism, Sacred and Profane, he really criticizes Huxley for these very same points. What is an authentic religious experience? Right? And he sort of takes a very conservative critique that if someone can ingest something, ingest a substance, ingest a pill, ingest a fungi, and have a quote unquote authentic mystical experience, then what does that say for all of the monks, nuns, priests, and practitioners who spend their entire lives in ascetic disciplines trying to cultivate these practices, trying to cultivate ethical norms? What does it say about morality? If someone who is not a quote unquote believer or even a moral person can sort of trip and have this experience and have an overwhelming mystical experience or experience of God. Right? So lots of thorny questions get raised around sort of like an insider outsider piece, like who gets to be in the God club all right, and who doesn't. And Zehner, taking a particularly conservative, critical stance of the counterculture and of Huxley, is very much against the use of these substances, saying that they're actually, he makes a distinction between sacred and profane experiences, saying that, well, someone who takes a psychedelic is having a mystical experience, but it's a natural experience, or it's a profane experience. It's not the same as a theistic or sacred experience that the mystics have through grace, right? So he uses the very traditional theological categories of grace versus nature, and then you can have a natural experience, yet it's not the same as sort of a theistic experience, like like one of the traditional celebrated Christian mystics would have through the grace of God, like a unitive experience through the grace of God. Right? So, of course, a lot of these arguments don't necessarily hold up, but that's the theological framework that Zehner is following. Right? More recently, there's been the development of the MEQ, or the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. And this has also come under some critique from scholars of comparative mysticism, because a lot of these categories in the MEQ, are based on William James's categories from his early 1900s varieties of religious experience. So questions of transience, the noetic quality, passivity, internal, external unity. A lot of these categories have come under critique in the 20th and 21st century by feminist scholars, by historical critical scholars, saying that they're ahistorical, they're apolitical, they're acontextual. So what you see in these debates around mysticism and definitions of mysticism are a lot of the sort of postmodern critiques of the study of religion and religious experience in general. But a lot of the folks that are adopting this MEQ today are more medical model psychiatrists. They're not scholars of religion and mystical experience. So you have this interesting sort of divergence in who, it's always the question of power, sort of Foucault's piece about knowledge and power, that you have these sort of knowledge holders in our society, whether they're medical professionals or whether they're professors, and they're sort of debating amongst them. Well, the medical people don't really care so much about these arguments, but the scholars of religion are the ones who are really sort of who gets to play in the sandbox and who doesn't. The medical psychiatrists are more interested in healing. They're more interested in data. They're more interested in the efficacy of these substances. A lot of this goes back to the beginnings of this sort of debate between the scientific psychological community versus the sort of scholars of comparative religion. Goes back to Walter Pahnke's 1962 Good Friday experiment. Pahnke was a doctoral student at Harvard who was supervised by Timothy Leary to experimentally examine whether a religious set and setting would lead to a psychedelic mystical state. So what Pahnke ends up doing is he ends up dosing a group of graduate student volunteers with psilocybin. 9 out of 10 reporting that they had a religious or mystical experience, or, quote, the deepest religious experience of their lives. Leary famously states that this Good Friday experiment was a scientific demonstration that mystical experience could be produced for and by those who sought it. Now, this experiment happened on Good Friday at Marsh Chapel in the basement of Boston University during the Good Friday sermon that was given by Howard Thurman. So it was quite a historical moment on many accounts, and a very interesting experiment around this question of what is an authentic mystical experience, and how does one go about doing it? Is it through ingesting a substance, or is it through a lifetime of spiritual practice? And it might be both. It might be one or the other, but it certainly raises these very, very interesting and highly complex and highly contested questions about the nature of religious experience. So I just want to close with what's happening really today. I had mentioned the scientific medical community, such as NYU, that's been doing studies providing psilocybin to terminal cancer patients to alleviate and relieve stress and fear and depression at the end of life. And when they finished that study, they then decided that they would do a study specifically on religious leaders. So giving religious leaders hallucinogenic, psychotropic substances, in this instance, psilocybin, to understand mystical experiences. And this question really goes back to Huxley, and almost 100 years ago about Huxley's perennial philosophy. And our mystical and spiritual experiences, something that are a common core to all of humankind, or as the historical critical contextualists argue, is religious experience something that is local to the cultures in which they arise? It's the question of a fundamental sameness or of a basic difference among religious and mystical experience in different cultures. So the results of this study are going to be published within the next 6 months to a year. It should be very, very interesting to see what those results say about the nature of mystical experiences in general, specifically when you have, for example, a priest, a rabbi, and a Zen Buddhist Roshi, an Islamic imam, and it'll raise interesting questions about the nature of the cultural conditioning of our religious and mystical experiences. And again, this question of perennialism: is there a common core, or are our religious and mystical experiences contingent on our own personal practices? So I just wanted to thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm sorry I can't be there to do some Q&A discussion with you, but I hope that you received something from this presentation around this extraordinary explosion of interest, not only in psychedelics, but in mysticism and spiritual experience that's happening in our culture today. So thank you so much, and if you have any questions or comments, Dr. Blankenship has my contact information, and I'd be happy to hear from you.